Well, unfortunately, we really need about 4 more weeks to get all this done. We've had to kind of move through some stuff pretty quick, but today we're going to talk about the Tower of Babel. But I thought I'd back up a little bit and cover a couple of things that we had to move quickly through. One of the things that I mentioned early on, just in passing, was dispensations. And again, that would be another probably interesting short study to do. But we've moved through 3 of them really quickly here. When Adam and Eve were created, they were created in innocence, and that was if you follow the dispensational theory or idea of theology, and we do, that was the dispensation of innocence. And then once they fell, we began the dispensation of conscience, where man no longer lived under innocence, but they lived under conscience. And you see how that went, because you ended up in a flood. After the flood ended, there was a new, I don't want to say new, but there was additional information given to mankind, and we went into the dispensation of human government. So there's 7 dispensations, and in just a few short chapters, we have touched on 3 of them. So in chapter 9, Genesis, the first 7 verses, it says, "And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." All right, remember that statement there. "The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens and upon everything that creeps on the ground and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered." That's kind of interesting. It kind of sounds like before this declaration that maybe the relationship between man and the animal kingdom might have been a little different. But now it says, "The fear and dread of you will be over all these." And for those of you that fish, I know, Randy, you've seen this. You walk up on a shoreline and all of a sudden the fish just take off. Well, that's because you've cast a shadow, you've startled them, and they're fleeing. And for the most part, if you got a rabbit in your yard and he sees that you see him, he might sit there for a little bit, but eventually he takes off. Most animals are like that. They fear man. I think the only thing it doesn't, I've heard, is polar bears. And I've heard they're not afraid of people. But when you're that big, you don't have to be. So fortunately, there's no polar bears around here. Then it says, "Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. And you be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply it." So we see in verse 5, or in the end of verse 5 and in verse 6, really the institution of human government. And there's a responsibility that man has to each other to manage behavior. He said that I'll require man's blood from you. There's for shedding of blood, and also by the animals. So when you go through the law as it was given to Moses, you see responsibility. Even if your animal was to kill somebody, there was responsibility. You had to make a payment, or the animal had to die. And same thing with mankind. If they killed somebody, there was a punishment for that. And so how people get around that and say, well, we just, we can't do that anymore, I don't know. But anyway, and then verse 7 again, he reminds them again, or tells them to be fruitful, multiply, increase greatly on the earth. So we're going to remember that as we come into the next part. So now in chapter 10, well, actually, let's see. Yeah, we talked about that last week. In chapter 10, we're not going to go through this list and try to pronounce all these names and all this, but it's an interesting read to go through these and look and see how many of these names carry on to today, or derivations of them, where you see we're familiar with these names. Like if you go down to verse, let's go down to verse 9. It says, talking about the sons of Ham, and it mentions Cush, Egypt, Put, and Canaan, and it goes on, and some others. And some of these names come back through the history in Scripture, and even some of those names survive today. Egypt, for instance. But then it talks about Cush fathered Nimrod in verse 8. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The beginning of his kingdom was Babel. All right, so we'll remember that. We'll come back to that. Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh. Rehoboth, Er, Calah, and Resen between Nineveh and Calah, that is the great city. And then it starts talking about Egypt. So you see these great kingdoms and stuff coming out of these people, and pretty early. So it's not that, we were cave dwellers for thousands of years. People started building these kingdoms pretty quickly. Go back up to verse 5 in chapter 10. It says, from these, it named off the sons of Japheth. And it says, from these the coastland peoples spread in their lands, each with his own language, by their clans in their nations. Then drop down to verse 20. These are the sons of Ham, by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. And then verse 31, these are the sons of Shem, by their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. So it seems like, what we're getting here is genealogies, and now they're not complete genealogies, but they're focusing on certain people. But each of these sections ends with they were by their nations and where they went and their languages and everything. So it seems like something's missing here. Well, chapter 11 then is going to explain where all that came from. So we'll get there in just a second. But before we start on that, I thought, I don't know if you'd be interested in this or not. In chapter 9, in verse 28 and 29, after the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. So Noah started out pre-flood. He got through the flood, came out on the other side, lived 950 years. He lived 350 years after the flood. So we'll get to, I think, some interesting math here in just a second. But as you go through these lists of people, not so much in chapter 10, but in the end of chapter 11, it starts back with, here's how long this guy lived. And you see the curve from 950 years, all of a sudden just really tailing off. And, what are the reasons for that? I think part of it is climatic. People are now living in a much harsher living conditions. They have to endure the extremes of the weather changes and things like that. There's also the problem with, you're starting to see the effects that sin has had on humanity now, and it's starting to break down their bodies, really. So any mutations they've got, the next generation picks up that mutation and adds to it. And especially early on, there was a lot of, now some commentators, they say because of the inbreeding. I don't like that. That sounds like an animal term, but because of the closeness of marriage in these families, any mutations that people would have had are exacerbated. They're made greater because they just keep going on, and other mutations are added to that. And I think that's part of what shortened the lifespan too. So I think there was a couple of things. One, when the vapor cloud vapor that protected the earth initially at creation from all the effects of the sun and everything, that was taken away at the flood. I think that is part of what did it. But also, the mutations that just kept going and adding and adding. Something that you never hear anybody talk about, because I guess there's really no answer. You have these genealogies of the 3 boys and those families, but you don't see anything else about Noah. You don't see that Noah and his wife had any more children. So I don't know if, and some have suggested that maybe Noah's wife died shortly after the flood. We have no indication of what actually happened there. Or did the Lord just cause them to be like Abram? When we get into the story of Abram, and he went for a long time, and he and Sarah were not able to have any children. Maybe that was just shut off. I don't know. But the Lord chose to generate a new population from the 3 boys and their wives. And so we can all, at some point, be traced. Obviously, we can ultimately be traced back to Adam and Eve, but we can be traced back to Noah, and we can be traced back to one of these sons. That's an interesting study. It would take a little while to do, but to see where these guys all scattered. And it's likely, I think it's probably likely that most of us are descended from Japheth, because he would have gone up into Europe and that area. But I don't know, it's just an interesting study. But so anyway, let's do a little math here. You think about Noah, all right? So he lived 350 years after the flood. All right, so he was around for a little while. Sometimes when you study these stories or these histories, it feels like there's a lot of time in between them, but there's not necessarily. So you think of what Noah saw, all right? He saw the degeneration of civilization in a rapid manner, a relatively short time from Adam to the flood. And then he lived through the flood and all that. I mean, that would have been a hard year. And then came out and he lived 350 more years. And when you come out, you think, okay, guys, boys, let's get this right and fill the earth and all that. And so he lived another 350 years. He got to see all that. He got to see the Tower of Babel. We don't really think about that because all of a sudden Noah's off the page. But he would have been around to see this. One of the commentators I looked at estimated that through some different math. They said at the Tower of Babel there may have been at least 1,000 mature adults. So, you kind of think about when you see the pictures of the Tower of Babel in the storybooks and stuff, you see zillions of people around. It probably wasn't. It was probably a fairly small group because this wasn't very long. Look, here's the math. All right, in chapter 11, verse 10, these are generations of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he fathered Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. All right, so there's your start. So the other thing to think about is when Noah, if you look at the pronouncement that God said he'd only go 120 years, and depending on how you look at that 120 years, I think that it was probably 120 years until the flood was going to come. And Noah was 500 years old. It said after he was 500 years old, he had these 3 boys. It sounds like he worked for 20 years or so by himself or with other people that would help him before his sons came along. And then there was a period of time when his sons would have just been running around and in the way and taking tools and, looking, what did you do with my hammer and all that stuff. So kind of put that in perspective. But anyway, 2 years after the flood, Arphaxad was born. And Shem lived after he fathered Arphaxad 500 years and had other sons and daughters. And then Arphaxad lived 35 years. He fathered Shelah. Dropped down to 14. Shelah lived 30 years. He fathered Eber. Eber had lived 34 years. He fathered Peleg. And let's see here. So when you add that up, that's 101 years to probably from the flood to Babel. So a very short period of time, especially since people were still living 200-300 years or whatever. And this Peleg in verse 19, if you go back to, let's see here. Chapter 10 and verse 25, to Eber were born two sons. The name of the one was Peleg, however you want to say it. For in his days the earth was divided, and his brother's name was Joktan. Now, what this division means, there's some discussion. I personally feel like there was a supercontinent at one time, and it's been named Pangaea. And we've talked about this before, but as you put the pieces of the globe together, you can see where it looks like continents broke up. Because if you put them back together, they fit pretty good. That's my personal feeling, is that during the flood, all the fountains of the deep broke open, and it started breaking apart these land masses. So it's possible that these land masses started moving away at about the time this Peleg was born. But I don't think that's the likely reasoning. His name means division. But I think that probably he was born around the time of the dispersion at Babel. And so if that's the case, then it only took man 101 years to start messing up again. All right, so they just came through the flood. And you think about Noah again. He lived all those years after. The sorrow that he and his wife must have seen. Now, we don't know that he had other kids, but it's possible that he had other kids that never became believers and were washed away in the flood. He definitely would have had relatives that were taken away in the flood. So, and now he comes out on the other side. He says, guys, let's get this right. And they start multiplying and starting to generate families again. And in 100 years, he sees this act of rebellion. The other side of that, though, if you continue on with the math lesson here, if we go down after Peleg, when Peleg lived 30 years, he fathered Reu, then dropped down to 20. Reu lived 32 years, he fathered Serug. Serug lived 30 years, he fathered Nahor. Nahor lived 29 years, he fathered Terah. So now we're starting to see names that we're familiar with relating to Abram. When Terah had lived 70 years, he fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So now if we do that math, that's another 191 years from Peleg to Abram is about 191 years. So if that's the case, then 191 and 101, you get 292 years, assuming there's no gaps in the genealogy. It's possible that Noah knew Abraham as he started moving to Canaan. So I just find that kind of interesting that, like I say, when you read through this, you kind of think, man, there's just eons of time, but there wasn't. This happened pretty quickly. So Noah went through the sorrow of seeing family washed away. He went through the sorrow of seeing this act of rebellion, and he saw the dispersion of the people by their languages and all that. But it's quite possible that he knew Abram. So the Lord showed him this one that he was going to work through the family of Shem, comes down through and picks up Abram, and it's possible that Noah knew Abram. And I would say, if all these things happen this quickly, I would not see why it would not be likely. So anyway, just thought that was interesting. All right, so chapter 11. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. So what happened was first of all, they had one language, and it says the same words, or one speech, one tongue, different ways that it's translated. But one of the things that to remember here is that we did not evolve from a bunch of grunting apes, and we figured out how to scratch something on the wall that somebody would understand, and eventually we went into we were created with a language, whether the language is Hebrew or not, some think it might have been. It was more than likely Semitic, because these records would have been handed down to Moses and were probably in a Semitic tongue. But to get away from that caveman mentality and understand that these were intelligent people. They didn't have to develop. They were created with the ability to communicate with the Lord verbally. And and when they go back and they study and they find records from the old Sumerians and the Chaldeans, and all, these guys are around this time, and they already had complicated math. They had language. They had a way to write it down. They had alphabets and things like that. I mean, look at the hieroglyphics. How complicated that is. And a caveman figured that out. He just drug his way out there one day and started drawing pictures and made a language. I don't think so. So man can read, write, and communicate. So what they did when they went into the land of Shinar, they had started migrating towards the Fertile Crescent, which was even to this day is a very great place to live, as far as fruitful and all that. You look at, Israel would have, different times, the land of Canaan and Israel has laid waste and been, empty. But when the Israelites moved in, it became a great place. I mean, they could grow things, they could live, they could survive there in comfort. And even today, as they moved back in 1947, they changed it again. There's agriculture and there's all these things. So the Fertile Crescent is an area that the Lord prepared for His people.
So in verse 1 of chapter 11 it says y'all have one language, but in chapter 10 they're talking about the sons of Noah, and every time that they mention the son, they said that their language is their language in the nations. So was that after?
I think it was. I think that this is a genealogy, and then chapter 11 explains how those 3 verses where it talks about the different places and languages and everything. I think 11 is inserted there to explain this is how it happened. Chapter 10 could have easily been put starting at verse 9. After verse 9, chapter 10 I think could have been put there. But this, again, was a record that somebody had kept and handed down. And they said to one another, "Come," and watch for that word 3 times now. "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. So this is an area that didn't have a lot of, the quarrying and stuff available necessarily that you would see like maybe in Egypt or some of the other areas. And so they made brick, which would have probably, as Moses recorded this, probably was not lost on him that his people made brick, and they baked them and they burned them thoroughly to make them. So a lot of the houses a lot of houses and things in the area would have been made with baked mud. They would have built and put mud on it, and the sun would have baked it. But in this case, they had a process where they were baking these bricks so that it would be something that would last. But it said, come, let us build. It kind of feels like there was maybe a leader or a group of leaders that said, all right, this is what we're going to do. Come and let's get this done. And it would have been, more than likely, this Nimrod that was mentioned in the previous. Then in verse 4, then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. So there was nothing wrong with cities. All right, we've already seen cities, even with as early as Cain. We see urban development, settlements and things. So there's nothing declared against those things. But the problem here is, when we looked at, remember I said, remember where the quote where it said, the Lord said, go out and multiply and fill the earth. He intended for us to fill the earth, to multiply, become a large people, and fill the earth. And they're saying, let's make a name for ourselves. So first of all, there's pride there, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. So it's kind of a one world government, probably one religion and everything, but they didn't want to be dispersed. They didn't want to, so they were fighting against, really, this decree of the Lord, or what the Lord had told them to do. Now, why they built this tower, some have suggested maybe they were trying to fend against another flood. If that was their idea, why would they build it in a plain? You would think you'd build a tower up on a mountain, because if they knew, remember it, they're 100 years away from the flood, so they knew the history. All right, and some of them, you still would have had Shem, Ham, Japheth around telling them, this thing was 15 cubits above the tallest mountain. So you would think you'd go to the mountain and build something 17 cubits tall, but so I don't think that's the point. I think the point was this is a rallying point, probably governmental and probably in a religious setting, that the people would rally around, and it would be their identity. I'll come back to this. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people. They have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. So, it's ridiculous to think that they could build a tower that would reach the heavens. I think that's a figure of speech, that it would reach into the heavens. They're not trying to get to God. I think it was the beginning of idolatry. And it's not like the Lord was caught off guard and he just happened to be walking by one day and said, oh man, look what they're doing, I better stop this. I think it was more this idea of he gives them the chance to do the right thing, and they didn't. And he said, okay, now we're gonna put a stop to this. So the Lord's never caught off guard by anything, but he said that they're one people, one language. And this is just what they're starting to do with this. We need to do something about it. It's interesting. We've already come across two uses of the word come, let us. Come, let us. And it's almost like the Lord is kind of, I don't know, looking at them in derision. And he's saying, come, let us go down. And there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So they were building this tower, which most times is referred to as a ziggurat, which has a religious connotation. And they've actually found at least a couple of dozen of these towers in various states throughout that part of the world. So it was a common thing for them to build, apparently. It's also possible that Nebuchadnezzar worked on the tower, the actual Tower of Babel, that he knew where it was at. There's a plaque apparently that was attached to either that foundation or there was some record where he indicated that he was going to continue to build this tower. Now, whether he did any work on it or not, I don't know, but I thought that was interesting that there's a tie to Nebuchadnezzar a few centuries later, and he was a builder, you know. Let's see. So the Lord confused the language and sent them on their way. So today there are something like 3,000 or so languages identified. And it seems like every so often they find one more. You know, they find a group that nobody ever knew. You know, there's a group in Peru that the Kilaue's, one of our missionaries, knows of, but no outside people are allowed to go see them because the government wants to protect them in their native habitat. And so no missionaries, no researchers, nobody, they just can't interfere with these people. They just got to leave them alone. So basically they've condemned them, you know. But they're trying to save their identity and everything. And so he's told us about that before, that it would be illegal for him to go up the river, find these people and try to evangelize or even contact them, even study their language. They just don't want them to be messed with. But as the people moved away, you can imagine there would have been three basic language groups with Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And as they moved further away, these dialects and these additional language would have developed. I'm no linguistics expert, but the studies in linguistics have shown that of all the languages that we know of, they can trace those back. They look at the commonalities and the families that those languages belong to. And I don't remember exactly the number, but it was very small that they've gotten back down to where they can show relation between all these other languages and this one, or all these languages and this one. Obviously, if you believe Scripture, it would probably be able to come down to three basic languages. But the other thing, the interesting thing about language is it's diverse. All right, there's all kinds of languages that we have no idea how to communicate with. And I'm not smart enough to do this, but people that can break down languages and begin to learn those languages, there's a lot of commonality between the languages, and even across the families, there's some commonality with whether it be grammar or whatever. And that's why we're able to learn other languages, because we can see these patterns and break those things down. But at the moment, you know, that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. But can you imagine, you clock out one night, you go home, have your dinner, go to bed, come up the next morning, come back to work and go to clock in, and nobody can understand each other. Or more likely what it would be is a small group over here could understand each other, and then these guys could, and then these guys could. Well, it couldn't work that way. We get by today with, especially like migrant workers and stuff that don't speak much English, but they can get by and get some work done and stuff. But you can imagine the confusion this would have caused and the discouragement, because now we just can't work together. So what they did was they started moving apart. And again, when you study chapter 10 and break it down with some of the commentaries that tell you where some of these people ended up, you know, whether they went to India, some went to China, some went, you know, all through Europe. Africa was populated. It's an interesting study. But one of the things is that Bruce Malone wrote a book. He's been here and spoken many times about the genius of ancient man, and I highly recommend that. And I've seen some other books too, similar to that, where what they find is these towers. So the Tower of Babel was some kind of a worship, was a religious rallying point, and what they have found is You know, you think about the Incas and the Aztecs and all the towers they built, and the Egyptians, and there's towers all over the world like this, step towers. Well, why is that? It's because they all had the same technology. They all understood the same building practices, and they were scattered, and they took that with them. So it should be no surprise. There's also, just like there's a lot of flood stories that culture has handed down, of course they become corrupted over time, except for what we believe is the inspired record here. There's the same thing with the Tower of Babel. There are various cultural stories where they explain how all of a sudden we couldn't understand each other and we started moving away. So, and those things have been handed down. Now, again, they're not accurate like we have, but because every time you tell a story and tell a story and tell a story, it changes a little bit. But the gist of it's the same, that those things, somewhere along the line, those things had to have happened. Or how else would civilizations that never touch each other know these things? Somebody had experienced that and handed it down. And then just a couple things to wrap up here. The technology, again, if you read some of these books about the genius of ancient man, the technology they had, they apparently had ways to saw things, saw stone, and even today, when you go to look at the pyramids and some of the structures in South America, in Peru and those areas, there are stones that are put together so precisely you can't put a credit card between them. They're that, you know, and they've been like that for thousands of years. But what they found is these structures came up all about the same time and in various parts of the world because they took off and took that technology with them. Something that would really be interesting to know is when the library, how they did all this, we don't know. And, you know, you got that crazy guy on the History Channel, and again, I don't recommend going to get my theology from the History Channel, but you got this guy that's got, his hair's all crazy and everything, and he's always talking about how they built the pyramids, and it always comes back to aliens. But the fact is, we have probably lost technology that we have not, you know, laws of leverage and physics and things that we have not rediscovered. When they burned the Library of Alexandria, it's estimated that it could have been 400 to 700,000 works, books, art, whatever, were destroyed and never recovered. So we don't know what we've lost there. And then when they did the same thing, when the Romans burned the Library at Carthage, it was not as big as the Alexandria, but it was a huge library. And there was, can you imagine the one-of-a-kind works that were lost? And the knowledge of the ancients, of Noah and his descendants, of Adam and his descendants, the things that were recorded and handed down, and all of a sudden were lost. So, the early man was no dumbbell. I think we probably, I don't, you know, we've got a lot of great technology, but the raw intellect, we probably don't compare to those guys because we've gotten farther and farther away from the fall, and the effects of sin are greater and greater on us. So anyway, I'll quit there. Hope you've enjoyed this. I'm sorry we had to kind of blast through a few things a little bit, but maybe someday we can revisit those again. So, any questions or comments or anything?
I've always heard the Tower of Babel was, as we had read the legends on this, that they were trying to build to get to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
That's not true. Yes.
I don't think so.
I think it is.
Well, okay, the language says that it would reach to the heavens. Now, whether their ultimate goal was to get to God, it could have been, but probably not.
They were trying to worship the moon, the stars, and the sky.
Mm-hmm.
My commentaries say, and so they wanted to get as close to heaven as they could to do that. And my commentary says that that's where astrology started.
Yeah.
Nimrod and
Yep.
his Tower of Babel, and a cult started
Yeah.
God, and so that's why they called it idolatry. Yeah.
You know, one more thing. This is just my 2 cents worth, because I've heard it preached both ways. Really, when you get to Abram, you're talking about he came from an area that worshiped the moon, and there would have been a human sacrifice and all kinds of crazy stuff. And again, this is just less than 300 years from the flood. Man has already fallen back that far. But often you hear that Abraham was taken away from idolatry. But when you study, it looks like they had already started moving towards Canaan. Terah had started moving them, but then they stopped, and then some of them died. But when we look at these accounts, it just sounds like, boy, the whole world is shot. There's just nobody that believes anymore. But remember that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He was a believer, right? He hadn't gotten his divine appointment yet, but he was a believer. And so I wonder, Abram and his family, again, they were descended from Shem. They are the line of Christ. I got to believe he was protected from that. And he was, just because everybody else seemed to be failing, doesn't mean there wasn't any believers. And I just wonder, Abram was probably a believer, and Terah and Haran and Lot, and they were being called to move towards Canaan, where they were going to set up shop. So to say that Abram came out as an idolater and was converted, I don't know. I think that might be a stretch. But that's my 2 cents worth. So, all right. Anything else? Yeah. I think I told you guys this. One of the History Channel things, they had a big thing where they did all this DNA research, and they decided that everybody is descended from, I think it was just 7 or 8 women in Africa. Well, read the Bible. It's less than that. It's 3. Yeah, that's interesting how they can drill back. And I also saw, you get in your feed, you get these crazy news articles and stuff. They say, oh, they figured this out, or they found this, or whatever. I saw one I thought was funny this week, and it said that scientists have discovered that we all have one ancestor. Big deal. Now, that ancestor is bacteria in their eyes. It was some kind of bacteria or something that somehow all the chemicals got together and just the right order and everything, and it kicked off life. But yeah, I think it's fascinating what they can find out in DNA and all that, and come all the way back to there's very few people that started all this. So appreciate that. All right. Anything else? Okay. Well, let's pray then. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time we could study and just scratch the surface of what you've done in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and how that sets the basis for everything else that we believe. Lord, we just again thank you for this time. Lord, we pray that as we go about our separate ways, you just give us a good day, keep us safe, and bring us back to the next time. In Jesus' name we pray.